Hey guys, it's Bella, and this week we're going to look at my favourite scripts, the most relevant ones, because they're the ones that I'm doing or that are relevant for me doing my PhD research, and these are the scripts that are employed in Anglo-Saxon England, so scripts that are employed in England until around the 12th century Common Era with the introduction of Norman Proto-Gothic. And like I say, it's a really high fantasy era, and I'm quite excited to start. A tangentially related bit is that although it doesn't really go into the manuscript so much, J.R.R. Tolkien was very heavily influenced, of course, in writing his fantasy series Lord of the Rings and other such books by manuscripts that are written in this script. He actually edited, for instance, a translation of Exodus that was based on, and he taught the Old English poem Exodus, which is based in a manuscript from this time period in Oxford. And I personally quite enjoy the Tolkien movie, the biopic, although it's not very popular apparently with fans. I recommend checking it out. It's quite enjoyable, although you won't get very much. You'll get a lot of language stuff in there, but not so much paleography, unfortunately. But anyway, so in pre-Caroline England, so in England before the Caroline minuscule script was introduced, there is a hierarchy of Latin scripts. Because prior to the arrival of Carolingian minuscule in the 10th century, English scriptoria used basically the same scripts as the Irish did, but they had some exceptions. So Elias Lowe in 1960 identified a distinctive 8th century style of English uncial, which is on the next slide. And charters in pre-Caroline England are mostly written in insular half uncial. English scribes appear to have used rustic capitals for rubrics, whereas the Irish don't seem to really have done this. They seem to have used insular half uncial for rubrics. And rubrics are sort of special bits of the text that one wants to highlight or bring attention to. And Anglo-Latin prior to the Carolingian Reformation is not characterised by as much of a research vocabulary as Hispanic Latin, but it is still quite florid and difficult to understand, and there is, it seems, a tradition of spoken Latin inherited from North Africa with the mission of St. Augustine in 595 Common Era. And an important point to note in all of this is that English scriptoria had closer ties to the continent and followed their fashions much closer than the Irish did. So this is why, for instance, they took up certain texts as well, like the Vulgate Bible, faster than the Irish. So this is a distinctive example of 8th century English uncial script, and it is in fact the earliest copy of the Regula Sancti Benedicti, which is the rule of Saint Benedict. And if I read out from the big red A, it says, Ausculta, o fili, precepta magistri, et inclana aurem cordis tui et. And there's a couple of interesting points to note. First of all, the two I's on fili have been elided to just one, because it's quite a phonetic, well, not quite phonetic, but it's a relatively phonetic spelling of Latin here, because it's quite an old text. Here also we have the earliest charter to survive from Anglo-Saxon England, and it's written in its original form. So we have some copies of earlier charters in later manuscripts, but obviously the script isn't going to be the same. And here we have the very earliest charter surviving, and it's written in uncial script. It's quite pretty. Here is actually the earliest translation of the Bible into English, and it's in the form of an interlinear gloss. So it's not fully it's a very literal translation because it's word for word, as it were, but it's still very useful for the study of early medieval English. And the Latin script itself is written in a quite elegant insular half uncial, as you may recognise from an earlier lesson. So we need a little bit of history for context about the Vikings and educational decline. So in the 9th century Common Era, England was subjected to numerous Viking raids, which correlates with a drastic decline in literary production. The Vikings were attacking England like that barking dog outside my room right now. The Viking-led Danelaw appears not to have absorbed the literary nature of the pre-existing Anglo-Saxon state bureaucracy, so they didn't use written records in their governance, despite leaving many other elements of the Anglo-Saxon Danelaw unchanged, at least according to the latest archaeological consensus. The Danelaw period caused many Norse loanwords to be borrowed into Old English, even if the archaeological material record remains much unchanged. And a high percentage of the Norse loanwords in modern English are common words, which indicates a very high degree of contact between the Norse and the Old English. And Old Norse at the time of the 8th and 9th century would have been basically mutually intelligible with Old English. So it appears that what happens is that the Vikings used words that the early English recognized, and the English did the same. And what emerged from this in the north of England is a sort of mixture of the two languages. And King Alfred indeed laments in his preface to his translation of Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care that there was nobody north of the Humber River who could read a letter written in Latin, because the Viking raids had destroyed literary production to such an extreme extent. So Bede writes in his Ecclesiastical History of the English People that there were at the time of his writing 5 languages spoken in Britain. There was English, Brythonic, and that's the ancestor of Welsh. There was Pictish, which is now extinct and undeciphered. You had Scottish, which is Irish, and Latin, which is often forgotten, but people forget that Latin was very much part of the linguistic makeup of early medieval England. And although manuscripts were almost exclusively written using the Latin alphabet, there were other writing systems which existed and were employed on the island of Britain, and these two are the Ogham script, which is a script that seems to be indigenous for the Celtic languages, and the Ruthwell runes, which are Anglo-Saxon variants of the Elder Ruthwell Germanic rune set, and it's mostly used for Germanic languages. And in some of these inscriptions we have the earliest identifiably English words, although in some artifacts the Ogham and Ruthwell runes are used interchangeably with Latin and vernacular languages. It's quite interesting. We don't need to know it that much because it's not too relevant, but the Ogham alphabet is quite interesting. It looks almost like something in a fantasy world, really. You have these notches along a line, which makes it quite good for carving into monuments, but it can also be used for letters and personal notes, and there are records in the Irish sagas to kings writing letters to each other, presumably in the Ogham script. This alphabet originally contained 20 letters, and there were 5 added in later periods to accommodate the diphthongs which developed during the Old Irish period. Ogham artifacts are mostly associated with Ireland, although some are found in Western Britain as well. Some of these are bilingual and they contain Latin inscriptions as well, and also writing in the Latin script. And the orthography of these Ogham inscriptions can indicate elements of population demographics in early medieval Ireland. So for instance, the presence in early medieval Ireland of people with weird names can indicate that, or whose names are written in a strange way, can indicate that this person has come from abroad and is introducing foreign sounds into Ireland, basically. Here are 2 examples of Ogham, one of which is part of it is a Runic inscription and part of it is an Ogham inscription. And on the right we have one of the longest sentences in Ogham attested in a manuscript, and I believe it says in Latin something to the effect of "money is loved by all, without money nobody is loved." So you can see here the Ogham alphabet being used to write in the Latin language as well as the vernacular. So let's move on now to Ruthwell runes in Anglo-Saxon England. The Germanic runes are an alphabet of uncertain origins which were used to write various Germanic languages, and the runes are characterized by having straight lines which are quite useful for carving into stone or into wood. So like Ogham, although the runes could in theory be used for writing in all of the same context as Latin script, in reality Ruthwell runes didn't usually penetrate most contexts of writing. So runes may have been used for small personal communications or memoranda, but they, with the exception of having alphabets written out in manuscripts, were not incorporated into manuscripts. We have one manuscript from medieval Denmark called the Codex Runicus, which contains laws written in the runic script, but it seems not to have been the script of texts in manuscripts. And contrary to popular belief, runes were not especially magical, nor associated with Germanic paganism. I get this all the time. And in fact, the majority of the fewer than 200 items bearing Ruthwell runes of the Anglo-Saxon variety are actually associated with Christian context, such as in the tomb of St. Cuthbert. The tomb of a saint has runic writing on it, and this, I think, is the best proof that it's not a especially pagan thing, the runes. So stop claiming that. Here are the runes. It gives you the name of the rune, so feoch, ur, thorn, etc. It gives you the sound that they make and the meaning, or the interpreted meaning of what the name actually means. And here is the earliest identified runic inscription from early medieval England, which is the Castor by Norwich astrolagus, which is an ankle bone from the 5th century Common Era, and it has the runic inscription Rehan, or row, and it's possibly the earliest English word that we have attested. Very exciting. And here is also the Frank's casket, which you can see on display at the British Museum, and this artifact is really interesting. It's a sort of combination of ancient Germanic iconography and language, but also of a new Latinate culture that was entering England in the early Middle Ages. And in fact, because you have Latin script and the Latin language on the right hand side horizontally, and you have the runic script, which is used to write in Latin, on the left hand side horizontally. And the scene tells you the story of the fall of the Jewish city of Massala to Titus Vespasianus. So you can see this story of Roman imperial conquest encased in this sort of animalistic Germanic artwork, with the animals diving into each other in the city itself, and surrounded by this Celtic knotwork art characteristic of early medieval Britain and Ireland, combined with some of these overtly Christian messages and symbols, but also the runic and the Latin alphabet side by side, which you can use for different languages equally in this time. So this shows you how the two scripts really became fused in at least in inscriptions of early medieval England. Here is one of my absolute favourite artefacts from early medieval England, which is the Ruthwell cross. And the reason it's so exciting is because the Ruthwell cross, along with St. Cuthbert's tomb, is one of the few times where archaeology and history directly overlap. So what this is the Ruthwell cross is a stone cross dated to around the 7th century Common Era. And you can see on the very right hand side of the screen the runes which are carved along the side of this cross transliterated. Now, this is a poem, The Dream of the Rood, and it begins with the line Christ was on Rodi. And this very same poem is actually found in a 11th century manuscript known as the Vercelli book, and you can see in the second line here it begins Christ was on Rode. So you can see that this poem, written down in the 11th century, was at least known somewhat way back in the 7th century. So it's a very old poem in early medieval English culture. And the Ruthwell cross itself is a really fascinating fusion of Germanic, even pagan elements with Christian culture. There is one side of the cross which is written in runic inscription, which is what this is, and the other side has writing in Latin, where Jesus talks about, which has a line saying how Jesus trod down serpents in the desert, and that other side has human figures and biblical scenes, whereas the side that is written in runes, and which maybe the early medieval English would have understood, has full of naturalistic and animal scenes, such as vines weaving into each other, birds, dragons biting each other, and it's sort of giving this message that English and these runes, perhaps to some level, were early on associated with the natural world, but they're being incorporated into one with the Latinate Roman world of the book and of the city, and of the Christian church, which is represented by the Latin text and the Latin language and the figure of Jesus on the other side of the cross, all incorporated into this Christian poem that's a really beautiful English craftsmanship. And which might have actually been used as a tool of worship, because the runes themselves, when you look at them from standing up, they're not really visible. You have to actually kneel down, but when you kneel down, the runes, because of how the light works, they sort of stand out, and this act of submitting to Christ brings forth this knowledge into the world in a language which is intelligible to both the Latinate clergy and to the early medieval English, Old English speaking people. So it's this beautiful act whereby, through their mutual submission to the Christian ideal, they both engage in a process of social cohesion, unification, and learning together. And it's just a really interesting poem, fascinating, but highly recommend, if you're in London, that you go to the Victoria and Albert Museum and you look at the Ruthwell Cross, or you can read the Vercelli book for free online and read this wonderful poem. Absolutely beautiful. Here is a less exciting one, but it's still pretty good. This is the Sax of Bergnoth, and actually, weirdly enough, just has the Futhorc alphabet written out in the Futhorc order, and then it has the guy's name Bergnoth. And on the right we have a Anglo-Saxon tombstone which shows you some writing in runes and some writing in the Roman script, showing how they would often be fused together in the same artifact. And it's worth noting that J.R.R. Tolkien modified the version of the Germanic runic alphabet to use for his dwarf script, unsurprisingly given how influenced he was by early medieval literature. You might notice also that the capital letters in his humanist minuscule script, such as in, say, the Desolation of Smaug, the T, the D, and the S, these forms are borrowed from Insula Half Unseal, which is the script in which so many of the early medieval English manuscripts were written. Very interesting stuff. So, the reason I've shown you the runic scripts is because actually in early medieval English the runes influenced Latin script. The Germanic runes were made for writing the Germanic languages, so they can represent Old English quite faithfully. You have one rune per sound. And when scribes started to write Old English using the Latin script, which is developed for the Latin alphabet, they started to run into problems, because the Latin alphabet doesn't have some characters for several common sounds in Old English, such as the f, the word to some extent, and the a sound. And in order to account for this, scribes borrowed in the following runic letters and they used them in Latin script. So you had the thorn, which was a rune, and its sound is the f sound. You had the ash, which is like a, it's sort of in the name, and the win, which is right there. You can see it written out. And you can see how the shapes of the thorn and the win, and to a lesser extent the ash, look like their runic counterparts. And there was also the modified Roman letter D, which is the F, and is used for the softer dental fricative in Old English. Now in IPA they're allophones, so you write it with the same symbol, which is the Greek letter theta. But a good way of illustrating the difference is thigh is a thorn in Old English, and that is an F in modern English. So that's a way you can sort of identify the difference between the sounds in modern English. They are actually different. So the difference between either and ether in Old English is entirely based on the difference of that consonant, and it's very rare for world languages actually to distinguish between these two consonants, but early medieval English did, and it used the letters thorn and F, one of which borrowed from runes, to accomplish this when writing in Latin. We need to go on also to talk about Greek in early medieval English manuscripts as a sort of exotic or a magical language. So when Roman education declined in Western Europe in the 6th century Common Era and thereafter, knowledge of the Greek language became extremely limited because there was less contact with the East, where Greek was the Koine common language. And so it was very limited in early medieval Britain and Ireland, although the early medieval Irish they cultivated Greek loanwords in dictionaries and brought them into their Latin, but they still didn't speak Greek very well. And in the Deeds of St. Brendan, one of the miracles Brendan performs is being able to read aloud the Greek text of a gospel book, which is given to him by the British scholar Gildas. So this is a sign that it's miraculous that Brendan is able to read Greek despite being an Irish monk. And this goes to show you how rare they considered knowledge of Greek to be at the time. However, Mary Bodden in 1988 has challenged the view that knowledge of Greek was extremely limited in early medieval Britain and Ireland, and she points out that half of the extant manuscripts from Anglo-Saxon England actually contain Greek writing. And indeed there was a Byzantine called Theodore of Tarsus who was appointed as Archbishop of Canterbury in the late 7th century. And his ability to do this shows that Latin must have been the spoken language within the church, because Theodore of Tarsus can't have spoken English. There's absolutely no way, at least not before he came. So he must have navigated England by speaking Latin. But he is associated with the production of some Greek manuscripts at Canterbury, and chances are very good that he would have taught Greek to at least the first generation of students working under him in Canterbury. So there would have been some tradition of Greek education in early medieval England, and we know that the Venerable Bede also seems to have been able to read and write Greek, but we don't have evidence, I think of Bede writing Greek, but certainly of reading it. But it should be said that few early medieval writers could. So here is an example of a Greek text being used in a insular manuscript. This is a copy of the Psalter, and it says Beatus virique non ebi Macarios aner hos uk blah blah blah, and then it goes on. To my understanding, actually, the Greek letters employed here are not very well executed compared to Byzantine models, so maybe they have this sort of decayed, fragmented tradition of Greek scholarship that's surviving in order to produce this Gospels, or maybe they're just copying out from a Gospel book but they're not very used to writing out the letters. Who knows? But the use of the script lends a sort of aura and prestige to this Psalter book. And here we can, in this triangle-like thing on the left, we can see the Alpha and Omega symbol, which is very important in Christian worship and was quite common, therefore also in Anglo-Saxon England. And this is sort of, I'm bringing this in to show that some Greek symbols would have persisted just because they're very common symbols in Christian worship in general, and therefore would have been included in the Christian worship of early medieval England also. So we need some more history for context now when we're talking about King Alfred of Wessex. So King Alfred was the one who prevented the Viking Danelaw from taking over all of England at the Battle of Edington. And Alfred eventually reconquered the whole of Wessex, and he went on to conquer all of the former English kingdoms back from the Vikings by the 880s Common Era. And with Alfred's new centralised government, although he still faced a lot of threats from Viking raiders, he began very significant top-down reorganisations. He implemented what's known as the Burgle-Hidage scheme, which made local noblemen responsible for supplying a fyrd or army from their given areas, with fortified cities at their centres, to create a sort of common standing army which would always be ready and always available to meet the threat of Viking raids. And this is one of the things which put a stop to Viking raids, or at least, no, it didn't put a stop to Viking raids, I should say, but which helped to stave off Viking raids during Alfred's government. Alfred also promoted the use of Old English as a literary language, since in his time very few could read and write Latin, and we'll see his preface written down below where he says exactly this. And they standardised the way that Old English was written around King Alfred's dialect, around the West Saxon dialect of Old English, and this is now a standard today because the vast majority of Old English writing is actually written in the West Saxon dialect, and we have a couple of times where it's written in a West Saxon dialect with a couple of spellings that indicate that the scribe might have come from a different area, such as Northumbria, but generally West Saxon is the standard formal dialect of Old English. And here we have the Alfred jewel, which is quite pretty, and a penny of King Alfred with a monogram of Londinium, a city which he put a lot of investment into. So now let's look at the main script in which Old English is written, and this is Littera Cursiva Anglicana. Anglo-Saxon minuscule script, and it went through 3 distinct stages over the centuries. Notice that what I'm calling Anglo-Saxon minuscule script here, it is the same as insular minuscule script. It's the same script as the Irish used, but there are 3 Anglo-Saxon varieties of it which developed over the 3 centuries of Anglo-Saxon sort of large-scale vernacular literary culture. These 3 stages are the first one being Anglo-Saxon pointed minuscule, which developed in the late 9th century Common Era. This is a development from earlier shared insular forms, and it developed during King Alfred's revival, and the characteristic point of it is these finely tapering descenders, and sometimes it slants a bit. It's very identifiable, you'll see in a bit. Anglo-Saxon square minuscule, which developed in the 10th century Common Era, is a rather upright kind of script, and its key characteristic is that it forms curved letters like the A and the Q through vertical minim strokes and hairline tops rather than curves, and it gives it a very notorious A that looks a bit like a box. And lastly, we have Anglo-Saxon round minuscule, which is influenced by newly imported Carolingian minuscule script in the late 10th to 11th century Common Era, and this is a obviously round version of the square minuscule script. So let's take a look at this. This is pointed minuscule, and this is King Alfred's preface to Gregory the Great's pastoral care, and I will read from the end of the second line for you, and forgive if I make mistakes in my old English pronunciation, but so that you get a sense of it. Swa clan heo was odd fail nu on Angelkinne, that swe the fairwa wardan behirnan humbra, they hear the thinninga kuthen understandan on English, other for them on arden jerit of ladene on English aretian. On each way that, noch money beyondan humbra narden, swa fair hero a wardan, that each for them an lerne, ne mai jethenchen besutan temese, thada each torriche feng. God almichtium sie thonk, that we nu anie on stal habat larewa, on forlon ich they bebiode, that du do swa ich lieve that the wille, that du they lisa world thinga to them ye almichtie, ametia swa du oftost maya, that du done wisdom that the God selde thar, these sien befastan maya. So here Alfred is talking about how there's nobody sort of north of the River Humber who can understand or translate a letter from Latin into English, and that he was struggling to find a competent teacher even south of the Thames. But now he's found one, and he hopes that the person he's addressing this book to will follow in his example and basically make knowledge and education more available to the population. And we can see the characteristics here of Anglo-Saxon pointed minuscule on the page, mainly the sort of finely tapering descenders. It's relatively thin in terms of its nib compared to other scripts. Yeah, those are the main points to bring up, really. The letters are still quite rounded as well. Here is, that's there we are. Anglo-Saxon square minuscule. So here if you look in the middle lines, you can see in the line that is fifth up from the bottom, verberas, the as at the end before the ut. That a almost looks like a u because it almost looks like a little box, and it's got a very flat top. And in most extreme examples of Anglo-Saxon square minuscule, there does seem to be a sort of, it fits between 2 lines. The at least the minims fit between 2 lines, and it's very consistent and controlled, so that the script fits very precisely between those 2 lines, and it has a rather flat appearance to it. And this flat appearance is how you can identify Anglo-Saxon square minuscule, especially in the shape of the A. Here we have Anglo-Saxon round minuscule, and I mean, it's the obvious thing, it's round. The descenders are still somewhat tapering, but it also, the way you can tell it apart from Anglo-Saxon pointed minuscule is that it has generally a bit of a thicker nib, and also that it has a more rounded shape to it in general. It's a bit hard to say here because some of the letters are clearly influenced by Caroline minuscule script, but I mean, yeah. And also you'll sometimes still see the flat top A, and that's an indication that it's round minuscule. If you have some flat top A's when most of the A's are rounded, that's an indication that it's Anglo-Saxon round minuscule, because you've got the Anglo-Saxon square minuscule style, which is evolving into round minuscule, whereas the flat top of A didn't really exist in the pointed minuscule time. So the Anglo-Saxons appear to have been especially aware of the discrepancies between writing in English versus Latin, and this is quite an understandable product of the Benedictine reforms, which swept England in the wake of Viking assaults. And in essence, what the Benedictine reforms did was they expelled the secular clergy who had been teaching to the populace and fulfilling many of the same roles as sworn monastics were doing, and made sure that there was a process of qualification involved, so that people who were leading religious life in medieval England were monks and they were not secular people. And the Benedictine monasteries encouraged education in Latin, and especially in a very ornate style of Latin, which Michael Lapidus has termed hermeneutic Latin. And this was how they distinguished themselves from the secular clergy, who were associated with speaking the vernacular language. And this vernacular language is very exclusively written in minuscule script, whereas Caroline minuscule was used exclusively for writing Latin. And it's to such an extreme extent that even a single Latin name or sentence within an English minuscule book would be written with Caroline script. And let me put it another way as well, that almost all Old English text is written in some form of insular minuscule, some form of Anglo-Saxon minuscule. You never see it written in Caroline minuscule, or in half unseal, or anything like, or in unseal, or anything like this. The Old English would still use rustic capitals, sometimes for writing Roman names in order to imply their antiquity, and English minuscule was the basis script used for vernaculars. So I want to look at a case study to show you how scripts and language interplay in early medieval England, and this is one of my favourite manuscripts. It is British Library MS Cotton Julius EVII, and it's what's called a legendarium. So it's a legendary, a collection of saints' legends, and it contains Alfred of Evesham's Lives of the Saints, and it also has a couple of other compatistical texts. And the table of contents at the beginning, which is a medieval copy, it lists other items that have been removed from the manuscript, showing us that the manuscript that we have today, and which you can access at the British Museum website following the link, it's an incomplete manuscript. But nonetheless, it's still a very fun read, and in this manuscript you can see the hierarchy of scripts in play. So here is the end of Alfred's preface to his Lives of Saints, and I believe that this is the only manuscript which actually contains said preface. And we can see here, the use of three different scripts. So we have Caroline minuscule script in the top half, above Alfred's name, because it's written in the Latin preface. And then for the very first line of the Old English preface, when it changes to Old English, Alfred writes his own name in Roman square capitals, not in rustic capitals. But he writes the first sentence in rustic capitals. So Alfred gret modliche Athelwerd Elderman. So that is sort of crude rustic capitals, but then right below it changes and it goes into insular, and this one is insular rounded minuscule. Wait, no, it's insular square minuscule. No, I would say this is rounded insular minuscule. There's a couple of flat A's, but it's not universal. So this is insular round minuscule, and above the Latin is written in Caroline script. So you can see how when they change the language, the script directly changes with it it's almost like a change in accent. You can see this also in the list of chapters. So the red stuff is actually written in in square capitals, and rustic capitals are used for the first letters introducing the chapters, but the chapter names, except for the first one, are written in Caroline script. So the very first one, De Nativitate, on the left hand side, that's written in rustic capitals. The ones below that, such as De Sancta Eugenia, are written in Caroline minuscule script. But then, if we look at the list on the right hand side, it says De Sancto and then Athelfritha, and De Sancto is in Caroline script, but then as soon as we have an English name, Athelfritha, we have to change and we start writing it in Anglo-Saxon rounded minuscule script. So it's really marking out the English saints with an identity, a scriptural, paleographical, scribal identity in this manuscript that immediately makes them obvious on the page, and it's really interesting to see that. Here we have an example of in the middle of the page, Huata Eugenia, where Eugenia, this Greco-Roman name, is written in rustic capitals in order to highlight it. It's almost like suddenly putting on an accent, like you're telling a story about I don't even know, like some Scottish character and you put on a Scottish accent. That's sort of what it's like. And here again we can see the change because she is about to start singing. So it says, Huata Eugenia arliche farde, on that heo become, dar the Christianen sungen min mitjara blisse, dus marcien de God, omnes die gentium demonia dominus autem celos fecit. Eller där det hade med Gottes syndon derfla und richten sådliche helfen as you workte, Eugenia da mitchlum worth. So to translate that says, listen how Eugenia dangerously or suddenly travelled until she came to the place where the Christians were singing with great bliss, thus praising God. And then when it gives you the psalm, the psalm that they're singing, it's almost like a musical, this story. They have little verses that sort of relate to the story. It's quite amazing, like a proto-musical. It's real good fun. And then from the fourth line up, Vos Marcien de God, that's in Anglo-Saxon rounded minuscule, and as soon as we get to the Latin, they switch into Caroline minuscule. Omnes die gentium demonia, dominus autem celos fecit. And then right away, once they're done with that, they go back to and as soon as they're speaking in English again, Anglo-Saxon rounded minuscule. So you can really see how the regime of languages is really consistent here. It's quite astounding. And I'll read out this bit for you from the big F there, just because this is a really cool passage. Tha quathsa dad beta. Tha deoflu kumath tome, on me swede ye esiath. Stwilche to friath, on habath he on hand min aren hand ye weird, quathath that ich komme to him, und na he to me. Basilius him quath to, ne beothu afircht, ye lief sodliche on God, on senode hine eft, belag eft vaduru. So from the Eth it says, then the revived man said, the devils came to me and terrified me and frightened me, and they put my hand in theirs and said that I'm coming to them and they're not coming to me. So this is a man telling about an account with demons, which IMO is just metal AF. There's a lot of really metal stuff in early medieval English literature. Here is another one where the top bit is Old English and then the bottom bit is Latin, and you don't even need to really read it because it looks different on the page. The aspect of it just shouts at you that this is a different language all of a sudden. Again, like putting on an accent. It's quite interesting. So this is actually not related to the same manuscript. This is an aside. I mentioned how J.R.R. Tolkien was heavily influenced by Anglo-Saxon manuscripts and Anglo-Saxon writings in writing his fictional works, and this is actually one of the very few academic papers that he published in the journal Medium Aevum. Now, Tolkien, his main job, he didn't make his money off of being an author. His main job was teaching Anglo-Saxon at Oxford University, and this is one of the papers he published when he was there. And this paper is on the word síalhmhaire in Old English. Now, TLDR is, he says in this paper that síalhmhairans, it comes from the word sigil, meaning from the Latin sigillum, meaning a jewel, but in the English sense, it comes to refer to the sun. So from the word sigillum, meaning jewel, they see the brightness and they're like, this is a word that we're going to use in poetry for the sun. And then wara means a sort of inhabitant. And it comes to be associated with the people from Ethiopia because of the association of the sun burning their skin. But more generally, the word síalhmhaire starts to mean this sort of, well, basically a stand-in for any sort of demon. And like he says, a diabolic folk, although he sort of laments that the Ethiopians unjustly get associated with this through no fault of their own. And in the same manuscript, MS Cotton, MS Julius, EVII, we have a description of the síalhmhairans that I think is really interesting. So I'll read from the first line. Varquath se yead quokada. Me comanto silherwan. Ataliches hues, swa here swa entes, mit bernendum ergum, on je liches licum totum. Her the armes whereon swilche or matte bermes, her the clawa sharpe, on he silva unmildherte. Fastiliche me tuon to that swerten hell. So it says, then the resurrected man spoke. Síalhmhairans came to me of terrible colour, as tall as, and the word that they use here is entes, as giants, as tall as giants, mit byrnundum ergum, with burning eyes, on eies lithum tothum, and sword-like teeth. Her armes whereon swilche ormatte bermes, their arms were like enormous tree trunks. Her clawa sharpe, their claws were sharp, and they were sort of unmildherte, unkind. And these creatures dreadfully dragged me to that dark hell. And it's just, first of all, that's just so metal. Like, someone needs to make black metal out of that story. And I wonder, based on how Tolkien describes Ents in his Lord of the Rings, and how we can see them even in Peter Jackson's adaptation in the movies, whether he got the idea of Ents from reading this manuscript. And we can see in one of the manuscripts containing early medieval English poetry, MS Bodleian Library, MS Julius, Junius 118, folio 16, these black imp-like creatures which have sort of, well, we can't see their teeth, but they've got sort of sharp claws, dark skin, and they're sort of torturing Satan here in this manuscript in the pits of hell itself. So these might be depictions or drawings in early medieval art of síalhmhairans, of these sort of creatures. And you can see in, well, most of these are fan art, but on the right there's a very slanted image of Peter Jackson's interpretation of Ents from Tolkien's mythology. In the way that Tolkien describes them, Ents do very much sound like the way that they're written about in Alfred's Lives of Saints. So maybe Tolkien was inspired by his reading of Anglo-Saxon saints' lives in recording the Ents. I mean, he was inspired by early medieval English literature in so much of his work. We don't need to look for specific influence, but in this particular monster, maybe there's something to be said there. So we've reached the end now, and another manuscript which Tolkien must have been very strongly influenced by, and he almost certainly got the word Oliphant from, is this manuscript, MS Cotton Vitellius AXV, which actually is the manuscript which also contains Beowulf. And it contains this Old English translation of the text, Marvels of the East, which describes the bizarre, fantastical creatures that live in eastern countries such as Egypt and Ethiopia. These ones I recorded for the presentation because it records the dog heads, which I really like, but it also contains an entry for Oliphants, which is quite fun. This one is a herbiary, and it's got a cool drawing of a dragon, because this is metal AF. Here is an entry in the same herbarium for dragon root, which is just a fun name. Here are some more beasts, and this is basically a good time to draw an end to the lesson. So thank you guys so much for coming with me on this tour of early medieval English manuscripts. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you for listening, and have a good day, everyone. Bye.